My name is Emma Wilson. I was 22 years old when all of this happened, old enough to understand what was being taken from me, young enough to still doubt myself when it happened. In our family, I was the second child, the quieter one, the one who learned early that attention was not evenly distributed and that peace came from staying small. I grew up watching my sister take up space effortlessly. She spoke first, decided faster, and moved through rooms as if they were designed for her. I learned to observe instead. I listened, adjusted, and learned which parts of myself to soften so the atmosphere stayed calm. It wasn't something anyone told me to do. It was something I absorbed. By the time I reached adulthood, minimizing myself felt normal. I didn't expect praise. I didn't ask for a celebration. I learned to treat my achievements like private thoughts rather than shared moments. Still, when the email arrived about the awards ceremony, something careful stirred inside me. It wasn't pride exactly, it was recognition, quiet and tentative, like tapping on glass. The invitation wasn't grand, it was a simple acknowledgement of work done slowly, consistently, without witnesses. I reread it more than once, checking the date, the location, the wording, as if it might disappear if I trusted it too much. I debated whether it was worth mentioning at all. Eventually, I told myself it wasn't a demand. It was just an invitation, and in that small distinction, I didn't yet realize how much I was still hoping for permission. That hope lingered quietly, unspoken, shaping how I would carry the moment forward. I didn't know yet that this fragile optimism was about to be tested, not loudly, but in a way that would rearrange how I saw her. I mentioned the invitation one evening without ceremony. We were in the kitchen, the television murmuring in the background, my words placed carefully between ordinary sentences. I framed it casually, as if it were an afterthought, something I could retract if needed. I said there was an award ceremony coming up, that my name had been included, that I thought I might attend. She barely looked at me at first. Her attention stayed on her phone, her posture relaxed, unbothered. Then she smiled, not warmly, but with that thin curve I recognized as dismissal. She laughed once and said, "We don't have time for stupid awards," as if she were commenting on the weather. The words landed quickly, efficiently, and then she moved on. Already done. There was no argument, no raised voice, just a quiet repositioning of the room. What had felt fragile and private suddenly felt exposed, smaller. I stood there, nodding, absorbing it, instinctively smoothing over the moment so it wouldn't linger. I told myself she was busy, practical, honest. I supplied reasons faster than the silence could. What unsettled me wasn't the sentence itself, but how easily it was delivered, how little consideration it required. It made me question the weight I'd given the invitation, whether my excitement had been childish, whether recognition only mattered if it impressed the right person. Later, when others were nearby, she repeated the sentiment more casually, like a joke. Each time, it shrank something inside me. I laughed along, quieter each time, rehearsing neutrality. I learned again that certain things were better kept private. That night, I replayed the exchange more than I expected, not with anger, but with confusion. I wondered when I had agreed that my milestones were negotiable. I didn't confront her. I didn't defend myself. Silence felt safer, more familiar, and I let it settle in, shaping how I would move forward. By choosing quiet acceptance, I unknowingly reinforced the pattern, telling myself endurance was maturity, even as something essential withdrew, preparing the ground for a deeper internal reckoning I could not yet name then. Slowly, after that night, I carried her words with me in small, persistent ways. They surfaced while I was brushing my teeth, while I answered emails, while I lay awake longer than necessary. I didn't feel angry. Anger would have implied certainty. What I felt instead was doubt, quiet and corrosive. I began editing my own memory of the invitation. Maybe it really was insignificant. Maybe awards were performative, shallow, something people pretended to care about. I told myself that wanting acknowledgement was immature, that seriousness meant indifference. These thoughts didn't arrive aggressively, they felt inherited, familiar, like rules I had learned long ago. Growing up, approval in our house was unpredictable. Praise appeared briefly, then vanished without explanation. Attention went to whoever needed it most loudly. I learned to preempt disappointment by lowering expectations before anyone else could. Shrinking became a skill. If I asked for less, I couldn't be refused as sharply. So I rationalized her dismissal. I reminded myself of her responsibilities, her stress, her tendency toward bluntness. I framed her words as efficiency rather than contempt. I became fluent in defending her behavior to myself, rehearsing explanations that softened the edges. Each justification cost something small but cumulative. As the ceremony date moved closer, the weight of not speaking grew heavier. I avoided mentioning it again. I adjusted my schedule quietly. I researched transportation alone, calculated costs, debated whether attending mattered if no one noticed. The silence around the event felt deliberate, though no one had declared it so. Inside, a quiet pressure built. Not dramatic, not explosive. It was the pressure of holding two truths at once, that the award mattered to me and that acknowledging this mattered to no one else. I felt myself retreat emotionally, conserving energy, observing more than participating. I told myself this was maturity, that independence meant self-containment, but beneath that narrative was an older reflex, one that recognized withdrawal as safety. The closer the ceremony came, the more practiced my quiet became. I was preparing, without realizing it, for something beyond disappointment, something that required me to decide how much of myself I would continue to compress to remain acceptable. I noticed how automatic it felt to disappear, how quickly I translated dismissal into instruction. Don't ask, don't insist, don't need. The habit was old, reinforced by years of subtle rewards for compliance. Silence earned safety, compliance earned peace. As the days narrowed, I carried that silence carefully, like a container holding both fear and resolve, unaware that the pressure building inside it would soon force a shift I could no longer delay. That preparation unfolded quietly, without witnesses, marking the beginning of a change still forming inside me then. The days before the ceremony moved slowly, as if time itself was uncertain about arriving. Nothing dramatic happened, which somehow made it harder. There were emails to confirm, directions to double-check, clothes to decide on, all handled quietly, deliberately, alone. I did these things late at night, after conversations had ended, when no one was watching me prepare. During the day, I acted normal. I responded when spoken to, listened more than I talked, and made sure my presence remained unobtrusive. The ceremony existed only in my head, growing heavier because it had nowhere else to go. At home, indifference filled the space where acknowledgement might have been. Meals passed without mention, plans were discussed that did not include me. I noticed how easily the dates slipped by on the family calendar, unmarked, unremarked. Each omission felt instructional. It told me what was expected: efficiency, self-sufficiency, emotional quiet. I complied without protest. There was a strange humiliation in pretending the ceremony didn't matter, especially because it did. I minimized it in my own thoughts, corrected myself when anticipation surfaced. I practiced neutrality like a posture, holding myself carefully so nothing spilled outward. The effort was exhausting. At night, the pressure returned. I lay awake imagining small contingencies, rehearsing arrival and departure, preparing for invisibility. There was no audience for this preparation, no reassurance, no shared anticipation. That absence sharpened everything. I began to feel as though I were carrying something fragile through a crowded room, careful not to bump into anyone who might knock it from my hands. No one else knew the weight of it. The closer the date came, the more compressed I felt. It wasn't panic, it was clarity forming under strain. I started to understand that this wasn't just about an award or a ceremony. It was about how easily my absence was assumed, how readily my silence was accepted. I noticed how no one checked in, how no one asked what I needed. The realization didn't hurt sharply. It settled slowly. like a truth I had been avoiding. By enduring quietly, I was learning something uncomfortable about the limits of my role. I could feel a shift approaching, not dramatic, not confrontational, but inevitable. The pressure had done its work. It had stripped away hope and left understanding in its place. I didn't know yet what I would do with that understanding. I only knew that pretending was becoming harder than facing whatever came next. Something inside me was tightening, preparing, no longer willing to stay entirely unseen. That quiet tension followed me into the final days before the ceremony, heavy and unresolved. I carried it carefully, as I had learned to do with most things that mattered. Outwardly, nothing changed. Inwardly, the space I occupied was narrowing. Every unasked question, every avoided glance reinforced the sense that this moment belonged to me alone. That isolation was not imposed outright, but it was unmistakable. I stopped expecting acknowledgement altogether. Instead, I focused on containing myself, on arriving without disrupting anyone else's rhythm. This endurance was quiet, disciplined, and increasingly unsustainable. The longer I held it, the clearer it became that something would eventually have to give. I sensed that the ceremony would not be the climax, but the catalyst. The realization settled in quietly then. I expected the clarity to feel dramatic, like a decision or a line crossed, but it didn't. It arrived quietly, almost politely, during an ordinary moment when I realized I was no longer waiting for her to understand me. The waiting had ended without announcement or negotiation or internal resistance. Up until then, some part of me believed that if I explained better, waited longer, or proved enough, something would shift. That belief had kept me compliant and hopeful. Letting it go wasn't painful, it was strangely stabilizing, like setting down a weight I'd mistaken for responsibility and inherited obligation. I saw the pattern clearly then, not just with her, but with how I'd been trained to respond. Dismissal followed by silence, achievement followed by minimization. Each time I adjusted myself downward to preserve connection. Recognizing the pattern didn't make me angry, it made me still and emotionally grounded inside. For the first time, I stopped interpreting her behavior as something to fix. It wasn't a misunderstanding or a bad moment, it was consistent. That consistency removed hope, but it also removed confusion. I understood that my role had been defined long before this ceremony existed or recognition arrived publicly. There was relief in no longer negotiating reality. I didn't need her approval to validate what I'd earned. The award mattered because I mattered to myself. That realization didn't inflate me, it grounded me, quietly, firmly, without requiring distance yet, or declarations, or confrontation, or emotional theater of any kind. I noticed my attention shifting inward. Instead of scanning her reactions, I began monitoring my own. I asked myself simpler questions. What do I want? What feels honest? These questions didn't demand immediate answers. They asked only for presence and patience, restraint and self-trust forming slowly over time, silently, steadily. This was not empowerment as I had imagined it before. There was no surge of confidence, no urge to confront. There was just alignment. My expectations adjusted to reality, and in that adjustment, something settled. I felt less exposed, less dependent, less reactive than before. Inside, my own emotional boundaries forming. I could feel the endurance phase ending. I wasn't bracing anymore, I was choosing. That distinction mattered. Endurance had kept me safe, but choice gave me direction. I didn't announce this shift. I simply carried it forward quietly, deliberately, without explanation to anyone else involved, then or later on, internally. The ceremony was still ahead, but it no longer carried the same weight. It wasn't a test or a please. It was an event I would attend on my own terms. That understanding softened the pressure without eliminating the significance or meaning or quiet importance it held for me alone. I understood that clarity didn't require distance immediately. It required honesty with myself. That honesty would shape what came next, quietly and decisively. I wasn't withdrawing yet, I was aligning, preparing to move without needing permission or validation from her, from family, or anyone watching then at all, inside myself. This awareness marked the real beginning of change, not rebellion, not defiance, but orientation. I knew now where I stood. The endurance had done its work. What followed would be quieter, more deliberate, and no longer shaped by hope or expectation or appeal, but by self-respect growing steadily, quietly, forward. I didn't announce my withdrawal. There was no moment where I declared a boundary or explained a shift. I simply stopped offering parts of myself that had never been handled with care. When conversations drifted towards the ceremony, I let them pass without correction or elaboration. I no longer tried to make my excitement palatable. I didn't soften it, justify it, or hide it behind jokes. I kept it contained, not out of shame, but out of clarity. I understood now that explanation had always been a form of negotiation, and I was done negotiating. With my sister, the change was subtle. I answered her questions plainly, without filling the silence she left behind. I stopped anticipating her reactions. I didn't look to her face for cues on how to feel. This absence of effort felt unfamiliar at first, almost irresponsible, but it quickly became grounding. Silence became a decision rather than a reflex. It wasn't passive, it required attention and restraint. Each time I chose not to explain myself, I felt a small internal steadiness take shape. I wasn't withholding to punish her, I was conserving something that finally felt like my own. She noticed the difference, though she didn't name it. There were moments where she seemed unsettled, where conversation stalled without my usual accommodations. I observed this without commentary. The dynamic shifted without my participation, and that was new. I realized how much labor I had been contributing to maintain equilibrium. Without it, things felt uneven, unfinished. I didn't rush to repair that discomfort. I let it exist. It wasn't mine to resolve anymore. This silence didn't create distance overnight, but it altered the tone. I felt less exposed, less reactive. I was no longer preparing myself for dismissal because I wasn't offering anything that required her approval. The ceremony approached quietly, without fanfare or rehearsal. I understood then that boundaries didn't need to be visible to be effective. They only needed to be honored internally. By choosing silence, I stepped out of an old pattern without confrontation. The consequences of that choice began to unfold beyond me, shaped by absence rather than argument. I didn't correct assumptions or clarify misunderstandings as they formed. I allowed space where I once rushed to fill it. This restraint was not about control, but about respect for my own limits. For the first time, I wasn't managing her comfort alongside my own. I was simply present, responsive when necessary, absent when not. That choice shifted the balance quietly. Without my explanations, others filled the gaps themselves. I watched that process without interference. The silence carried information I had never been allowed to deliver before. It communicated finality without hostility, certainty without aggression. I stayed with that feeling, steady and contained, as the world around me began to adjust. That adjustment marked the beginning of consequences I didn't initiate or chase, but quietly permitted, standing still while outcomes moved forward on their own, without my guidance or correction or explanation now. The night of the ceremony arrived without ceremony of its own. I left the house quietly, dressed simply, carrying nothing that needed approval. There was no one to see me off, no last-minute questions, no reminders. That absence felt intentional now, no longer accidental. At the venue, I moved through the space slowly. I noticed details I might have missed before, the low murmur of conversations, the way people held programs like shields, the calm efficiency of staff who had done this many times. I was present without performing. My name existed on a list whether anyone else acknowledged it or not. When my name was called, I stood and walked forward without scanning the room. I didn't look for her. I didn't imagine explanations afterward. The moment passed cleanly. Applause happened, then ended. The award was placed in my hands, solid and unremarkable, exactly as it should have been. What struck me wasn't pride, but steadiness. I felt aligned with myself in a way I hadn't before. There was no internal argument, no urge to share or shrink the moment. I accepted it without negotiation. Later that evening, I learned she had mentioned the ceremony to others, reframing it casually, as if proximity alone granted relevance. I wasn't present for those conversations. I didn't correct the framing. Her attention moved outward, toward managing perception. Mine stayed inward, settled. The contrast was quiet but unmistakable. I no longer needed the room to mirror my worth. She still needed context, audience, validation. The imbalance had shifted without confrontation, without language. Power moved because I stopped offering it to discussion. I returned home late, placed the awards somewhere unobtrusive, and went to bed without replaying the night. The significance had already been absorbed. What followed would not be immediate or dramatic. The change was already in motion, unfolding beyond that evening, carried forward by the absence of my old participation. I sensed that something irreversible had occurred, not publicly, but internally. The night did not elevate me above anyone else. It simply removed a dependency I hadn't realized governed me. As I slept, I felt no urge to recount details or anticipate reactions. The story no longer required witnesses to feel complete. That quiet completion would shape the days ahead, as subtle consequences emerged elsewhere, shaped by distance rather than effort, by omission rather than intent. It was enough to know that the shift had taken place. The rest would reveal itself slowly. I had stepped out of negotiation, and the world responded in ways I didn't manage. That realization followed me forward, steady and unresolved. I allowed that uncertainty to remain, trusting it would carry meaning without my control, then onward. When I returned to everyday life, nothing announced the change, but it was visible in small disruptions. Conversations stalled where I no longer filled gaps. Decisions were made without my quiet coordination. The structure we had relied on felt less stable, though no one named why. My sister noticed first. She asked questions that didn't quite land, comments that searched for reaction. I answered briefly, accurately, without expansion. I didn't correct her tone or soften my responses. The absence of accommodation unsettled her more than confrontation ever had. There were moments when she framed my distance as moodiness or distraction. I let those interpretations stand, explaining would have restored the old balance, and I no longer felt responsible for maintaining it. Silence did the work I once performed tirelessly. What shifted wasn't authority, but attention. I stopped monitoring her needs, her impressions, her expectations. That withdrawal created space she hadn't prepared for. Without my participation, her influence weakened, not through resistance, but through irrelevance. I observed this without satisfaction. There was no sense of victory in watching the dynamic change. It felt neutral, almost procedural, like a system adjusting after a variable was removed. The power reversal happened quietly, without permission, because it no longer required my consent. I moved through interactions calmly, focused elsewhere. I invested energy in work, friendships, routines that did not orbit her approval. Emotional distance became sustainable rather than forced. I wasn't withholding, I was redirecting. Over time, the consequences clarified. She reached outward more, seeking reassurance from others. I reached inward less often, no longer negotiating my place. The contrast widened naturally. This was not revenge, it was consequence. When I stopped participating in a dynamic built on my compliance, it reconfigured itself. I remained steady, observant, unremarkable. The reversal held without commentary. What followed would not be dramatic, but enduring, shaped by detachment rather than action, by perspective rather than response, preparing me for a longer view that no longer centered her. It allowed me to see time differently, stretching beyond immediate reactions into something steadier. Distance no longer felt like loss, but like orientation. I was not waiting for acknowledgement or repair. I was already positioned elsewhere, watching the old pattern continue without me, understanding that my absence was the answer I would no longer explain. That realization settled quietly, lasting beyond this moment, shaping how I would move forward from then. My life did not become louder after that shift. It became quieter in a way that felt deliberate. The space I created did not echo with absence, it settled into calm. I noticed how little tension I carried now, how rarely I rehearsed conversations in my head. I saw my sister less often, and when I did, I observed rather than anticipated. Her moods no longer dictated my posture. Her approval no longer felt like something to earn or avoid. I could see her patterns clearly without stepping into them. Distance made perspective possible. There were moments when she attempted familiarity, reaching back toward the version of me that explained and adjusted. I responded kindly, briefly, without returning to old habits. This restraint felt natural now. I was not guarding myself. I was simply no longer available for certain exchanges. The calm surprised me. I had assumed distance would feel empty, but it felt regulated, almost generous. My energy returned in small, steady ways. I slept better, I focused longer, I felt present in my own life without scanning for reactions. I understood then that peace was not dramatic. It was maintenance. It was choosing what to carry and what to leave behind. I did not need closure conversations or reconciliations to justify the space. The detachment spoke for itself. From this distance, I could acknowledge her without resentment. I could wish her well without re-entering old roles. The relationship no longer required constant negotiation. It existed at a scale I could sustain. This quiet stability prepared me for reflection rather than response. I was no longer measuring myself against the past. I was oriented forward, steady, unprovoked, ready to understand what this shift meant over time, beyond immediate relief. It grounded me in patience and confirmed the direction forward. When I think back on that period now, I don't think about the award itself. I don't remember the wording on the certificate or where it's stored. What stayed with me was something less visible, but more durable. I carried forward an understanding of myself that didn't depend on reaction. I learned what it felt like to stand without waiting, to move without explanation. That understanding didn't make me harder, it made me clearer. There was no moment where everything resolved neatly. My sister remained who she was. Our dynamic remained changed. Neither required a conclusion. The absence of finality felt appropriate. Some things don't end, they simply lose relevance. I stopped framing the experience as something I endured. It became something I integrated, a recalibration rather than a reckoning. I didn't gain power over anyone. I gained authorship over my own responses. Emotional adulthood, I learned, is not loud. It doesn't demand recognition or apologies. It shows up as restraint, as patience, as the ability to walk away without rehearsing justification. It shows up as peace that doesn't need to be defended. I didn't win anything that night beyond clarity, and that was enough. Clarity stayed with me in conversations afterward, in decisions I made more cleanly, in boundaries I didn't need to explain. The story doesn't end with distance or reconciliation. It ends with orientation. I know where I stand now. I know what I carry and what I no longer need to hold. That knowing is quiet. It doesn't ask to be witnessed. It simply remains, steady and sufficient, shaping how I move forward, grounded, intact, and at ease with the silence I once feared, now understood as space.